Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me on Halloween. This is a very special episode of this that would normally be on a Friday, of course, but we had a chance to speak with our friend Fionnán O'Connor today, and today is his last day in the States, which I realized afterwards I could have easily interviewed him from anywhere in the world. However, he's here. We're both in Los Angeles. It just felt like we were in this would somehow be easier, but from a technological standpoint, I realized it's the same. But the other reason we're doing this live today, the more practical reason, is because Fionnán is part of a really exciting project that is going live literally while we're going to be talking today. So without further ado, I will invite him in here. Excuse me one second. There we go. And you have sound. Hello.
Hello. Oh, geez. Right on cue. Hello, everyone.
Well, thanks for joining me today, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to talk to you about this. I know a little bit about this, but I realize that there's no way I will do as anywhere near as good a job explaining it as you will. So, I'd love to if we could start by if you could introduce yourself a little bit, tell us a little bit about who you are for anyone that may not know, and then we could talk about the project that you're working on.
Grand. My name's Fionnán O'Connor. I'm a spirits writer in Ireland, specializing in Irish whiskey, with one pair of gloves on, and with the other, I'm an academic, and I used to work in kind of medieval history, which then became material history, which through a weird set of life, streams crossing became the history of whiskey, and the two things fused, and I've just come to the kind of ending stages of a PhD on the history of Irish whiskey spirit materiality, which in kind of whiskey geek circles would of course be mashbills, but in historical circles would be materiality. That's the big buzzword. And this has been going on for some time, tracing materials generally, like before there were mash bills defensively, just mashes, that have changed based on agricultural resources and whatnot, and then leading up to these mash bills. And then the very end section was a recreation of 10 lost Irish mash bills, or decimalized versions of them, in kind of controlled settings in Boan Distillery. So they kind of collaborated, and we had them each distilled in kind of shared conditions. Everything else that we could control was held constant. So same fermentation time, same cut points, separated feints, everything we could do. And then they were put before a panel of about 27 blenders and distillers, heavily Irish, but also a good helping of Scots for the cross-pollination. And we've kind of stitched, sensory analysis back into this, what's mostly an historical thesis, but it ends with, say, 10% of it is this kind of drawing from the well of what Irish whiskey can learn from what it lost, and these different grains. The big one being oats, which, like Irish whiskey had oats in it until the spirit had oats in it until the 70s, and a lot of the whiskey, it took until the 80s for the 12-year-olds to kind of stop having oats in them. So it's more recent than people realize, but like Old Powers used to have like 20% oats, and
it would appear that you've frozen, sir.
Oh no.
Now you're back.
Oh, grand. Okay.
Well, you're still frozen visually, but not. I can hear you fine.
Okay.
Let me remove you and bring you back in a second here. Hi, it's just me. Now let's see. Let's bring Fionnán back in. There we go.
Have I got frostbite on my fingers?
Yes, you have actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there. You're frozen again.
Let me try.
Okay, yeah, leave and come back. So Fionnán and I met last year. We went to Ireland with Carrie Moynihan for her podcast, and that was the first time. But that's not the first time that I had been sort of told about Fionnán and his writing, because we got to know Charlie McLean. He had talked about it, and then Fionnán O'Connor, no relation, had sent me a thing about some of the Irish press about Fionnán's work, and I have to tell you, there we go. You back?
Am I back?
Yes, I believe you are. Yeah.
Great. Well, if there's any consolation, I wasn't actually frozen. I was just pretending.
So I was just kind of vamping a bit and talking about how we met and my introduction to you and your work. Oh, we having drams. Yeah, sorry. I'm drinking out of my new glass that I got there the other day.
Oh, I forgot to take one home. My apologies. I hope I didn't slight the our generous donor.
I got this yesterday, the 2 stacks dram in a can, which I had Shane on here last year on this thing, so we spoke about this quite a bit. But so anyway, now this has become a new sort of a project that you're undertaking moving forward with a crowdfund campaign that's launching today. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So before the PhD, I wrote a book once upon a time on single pot still whiskey. Back when it was still, when I started, there wasn't that much of it. Middleton had literally just put out Powers John's Lane and Barry Crockett Legacy, which doubled the offerings, of single pot still whiskey core range from 2. Before that, it was literally just green spot and redbreast and specialty bottlings. So certainly a lot has changed. So I began that book in 2012. Even, as the term was changing from pure pot still to single pot still. And now, distilleries have sprung up all over the place. I think there's a photo in that book of like the stills being put into Teeling. Sorry, let me quit whatever the hell is making that noise. Grand. So I never wanted to kind of repeat that book. I wanted to kind of wait until there was a different book to write, whether not just wait for the industry, but wait for myself. And as I was doing the thesis work, kind of, thesis writing is a very different kind of writing. And as much as I enjoy academic writing, there's certain things you can't put in those types of texts. I could never convey the bizarre joy when I was doing the Bohème creations of like sitting with my feet on the table with the distiller Michael and chatting about what 10% more oats did in flavor terms. These bizarre, we were meant to keep a log of everything that went right and wrong technically with the distilling process, but thankfully nothing particularly serious did go awry. And so these logs just turned into these kind of like 9 a.m. new make tastings, and we were drinking the stuff at like still strength on top of everything, and in our heads, it was all very important, saying like, well, if we haven't tried mash bill number 3 against mash bill number 7 after having had mash bill number 2 yet, and these like networks of, but that could never go in. And when we had the panel, the like talks I had in the pub afterwards with people about the riffs they wanted to do on some of the stuff, that could never go in. And then even just stray stuff that was from the thesis research that didn't really fit with the core topic. A lot of that started bubbling up. A lot of stuff to do with the way that whiskey was drunk, rather than just what it was. The way that it fit into lived experience in Ireland and how that's changed. I've felt that since before the thesis. This kind of strange disconnect. If you look at Scotland has this kind of unbroken link with the past. I used to feel very strongly that, you walk into any bar in Scotland and the bartender, even if it's not a whiskey bar, there'll be something on the shelf and the bartender will probably be able to tell you a favorite malt or this or that. And in Ireland, it's changed a lot, but until very recently, a lot of people didn't really know unless you were part of that kind of whiskey scene, which was very much a kind of hobbyist scene, or you were over a certain age, or, a certain publicans, etc. And there wasn't a lot there. And you'd look around, and you look around pubs in Ireland, there's all these old mirrors for dead brands. And, of course, there's dead brands, in Scotland as well. But it's not really the same thing. This almost slightly kind of eerie feeling that this is all gone, that there's a kind of a will o' the wisp of it in the pub. And you see these old brands, all these distilleries closed down. And of course, from a material perspective, a lot of them took their mash bills to the grave, which very much consolidated what Irish mash bills were as a range. And then you get this strange sense of attachment when you have stuff from the 70s and you know what's in it, and so much of that, you know, has come back in recent years, not just in terms of revival, but a sense of inheritance where you get kind of craft distillers, you know, not just recreating the past, but kind of riffing off it in you know, like Brendan with his kind of peated malted oats, but also peated malted rye, you know, and or you know, in tandem, these kinds of odd projects, and that's really started to kind of excite me. So the new book is kind of drawn from a lot of kind of, you know, cannons firing at once that started to just build up a bit of, you know, air and gunpowder over time. A lot of stuff that had to do with kind of the way whiskey had been encountered as a cultural product, you know, how it appeared in folk music, and a lot of the stuff I'd seen before talked about in a certain kind of, I don't want to say twee, but, you know, a lot of it is wrapped up in kind of spielcraft, and I felt like a lot of the people telling these kind of yarns, you know, didn't want to be telling yarns. They want to be telling things in sincerity, but a lot of this stuff floats in kind of odd spaces and archives, and of course a lot of that couldn't make it in. But, you know, I think the day that kind of Crater in its current imagination was born was when I was looking for a record for a song, and the song couldn't go into the thesis, but it's called An Buchel Quail Dove, the dark slender boy, which is an old euphemism for poaching, after the dark bottle, basically. And I saw it in an index in the library of Fionnán O'Connor, who's quite an important, you know, he's almost like the Alan Lomax of Alan Lomax of Irish folk music. And there's a big trad music kind of archive down in University College Cork. It's the Fionnán O'Connor archive. And a mate of mine, Paddy, wrote his own PhD on O'Connor and has access to that archive. And I said, "Oh, Paddy, would you mind checking this out? It says poaching recipe." And he went, and it's on the back of a grocery receipt. I thought, oh my God. And then Paddy was following this mystery. He says, "Oh, well, this was probably Larry Dillon's recipe." And I said, "Well, who's Larry Dillon?" He says, "Oh, he's a man who used to have house parties back in, you know, 1962." And he's clearly describing, you know, blah, blah, blah. And anyway, and looking at this, and I was talking to Brendan, and Brendan said, "You know, to hell with it, let's make it." And that was where, you know, the kind of, you know, imagination for the second book came about, as this kind of recuperation. It's a book that pretends to be about the past, but which is really, you know, about the present, and the kind of the present haunted by the past as much as anything.
Well, you know, it's funny you mentioned Alan Lomax, because I was actually going to compare you in a way to Alan Lomax, because a lot of musicians, especially from the 60s and 70s, credited Alan Lomax for reintroducing them to a past that was almost forgotten. And I feel like in a way you've served as this kind of connective tissue for this new generation of, you know, I don't want to overstate it. You know, you're not, you know, John the Baptist. You know,
I'll take that compliment to the grave.
But, you know, I think you've connected a new generation of distillers to a past that was almost completely gone. And, you know, so, you know, I think it's pretty compelling stuff. I mean, it's like you said, Scotland has this uninterrupted connection, where in Ireland, I feel like it was kind of hanging by a thread, you know, and you've bit by bit helped been sort of adding some more threads. And
well, yeah, and of course, like I'm always reticent to take all the credit. There was interest in the air, you know, and people were already curious about this. But there's certainly like a lot of, even in kind of the academic background, a lot of things like Alan Lomax type approaches, or ethnomusicology, or folklorism, or any of that kind of stuff that involves people driving around with recording equipment, has always kind of, you know, set the heart a bit pitter patter. And there's certainly, you know, a long tradition of that in Ireland, a long tradition of recovery of folklorism, of, you know, again, someone I have a lot of esteem for, who's long gone. Was a guy, Seamus O'Delarga, and he was an ethnomusicologist, James Hamilton Delargy. He was from Antrim, and he had this very kind of iconoclastic approach to the whole thing. There was a whole kind of Celtic revival and all this kind of mysticism and romance, and he had absolutely zero time for this. And he said, no, we need to be interviewing old women about how they make rope, and this kind of on the ground, real people in their homes recording, and such a breath of fresh air. And he he had this line where he said the house is on fire and we're saving the furniture. What can be the people who believe in any of this stuff are dying fairly quickly in the 20th century, and either you catch them or you don't. And certainly, like in Ireland, I mean, even the idea of an old Irish industry hangs on a small number of living people. And it's not like Scotland where you have a whole environment of living people. You have, I don't want to call them out because then they'll feel old, but there are certain people who have been in it for a very long time. But then you also have just the fact that, like, the Irish industry is mostly made up of the children at this point. It's the new wave, and so there is that sense of everything being a little tenuous, and had it died just a little more, who knows how much would be left. There is that strange sense, and it's funny. Ireland is also covered physically in closed distilleries. I mean, a lot of places didn't have the money to knock them down, so if, you go out to Offaly and places, and they're crawling with ivy, and that's just because there's nothing else to do with the place. And you have that sense, even when I was doing the first book, the old Powers distillery, which for those who don't know is almost kind of like an Irish Stitzel Weller, the old John, even though the Powers brand survives, kind of the old physical Powers distillery closed down, and it became the National College of Art, actually, the NCAD. But again, the buildings of the NCAD have names like the Granary, that you can tell what they originally were. And then the old copper stills are literally just sitting out in the middle of the quad. And it always was such a striking that, they used to have a kind of a verdigris color. They've been cleaned up very, very recently. But it used to be this kind of, they're not connected to anything. They're just standing there, this haunting kind of sculptural thing. And I remember, when we went to take a picture of them, and there was the strictly no climbing on stills sign, which some student had changed to strictly no climbing on stilts. And there was a little picture of a man falling off, that's rubbed off. But, there was this, and I remember I took, Alfred Barnard's kind of 1887 whiskey distilleries of the United Kingdom around Ireland when I was doing that book, and just to find the addresses, and I just went to every address. And sometimes you'd see a little bit of a wall, or like, for instance, the Phoenix Park distillery in Dublin has been leveled, but there's a bit of the water wheel still sitting on the river. And if you go to the address, there's just apartments. But if you go into the car park underground, it's clearly the old bonded warehousing. The architecture is not 2010. It is clearly Victorian, and these old kind of subterranean what's left. And there's a lot of that. I mean, one of the more kind of eerie ones is the old Green Spot cellars, which run right under central Dublin. And just the middle of the city, and nobody knows it's there. And then you go underground, and it's just these long tunnels, and the paint's still there from the numbering system. And so there is that sense of a kind of a haunted drink, and part of, again, the lore, the title of the next book, Creator, is from a very peculiar nickname for whiskey in Ireland. The Creator, the best thing in nature. And it struck me at a kind of an early stage as already a kind of an interesting word, because it conveys the kind of worst of Irish cliche on the one part, loads of, and that's wrapped up in it too. It used to give me a kind of cringe, but especially written down in the kind of anglicized Creator. And then at the same time, when you hear it used sincerely, there is this weird mix of kind of a guilt. If you say someone's kind of always very fond of the Creator, there's a kind of demonic aspect about it, that there is something a little peculiar about drink and about spirits, the Creator. And even the idea of the thing, this kind of summoned. But then also, there's a weird tinge of like affection about the word, the Creator, the best thing in nature. And then the fact that it was literally the word creature, to create, the created thing. And I wanted to write a book that was about the creature as as a creature, as something made out of raw materials. The idea of grain, water, yeast, fermentation is already a peculiar process. Kind of you starve something, you've airborne yeast and then literally not enough air, and then you boil that off and recondense it. And it's kind of lost touch with that elementalism over time. I've felt for a long time, just because it's so familiar. And then creature as something that was made by context, by the history of Irish whiskey.
Uh-oh.
Cultural history has warped that. We're frozen
I think
again.
Yep, now you're back.
Oh, grand.
It's interesting you say that, because you were talking about fermentations already, this kind of mysterious thing. There's Michael Pollan did a series called Cooked, and it was a book, but it was also a series of documentaries made here for Netflix. And one of the things they talked about, it was fermentation used to be a cultural identifier where, and we're talking thousands of years ago, but people were, because almost all fermented foods are an acquired taste, because no matter what they are, people, even like chocolate, which is fermented, people say that's not an acquired taste, but milk chocolate's not an acquired taste. Dark chocolate very much is. Regular full-on chocolate very much is. And coffee, and, it goes on and on. But he said people used to have this attitude of, we're the people who eat fermented X, whatever it's going to be in. And then that would divide you from the people who don't eat that, whether it's kimchi or whiskey, or beer, it goes back to these kind of very early kind of, I hate to say experiments, because that implies a rigor that's probably, definitely wasn't there, but let's get him to try this and see what happens, kind of, the discovery of new food.
Oh yeah. I mean, I had a classics professor a long time ago, and he was talking about the Sumerians and pointing out that they had cheese, and he had this strange line. He said, cultures that write epic poetry tend as a rule to eat cheese. Now I don't know how true that was, but I always took him at his word. But there is a weird, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a strange, I mean, when you look at the history of medieval Irish food used to look very peculiar. There's quite an influential essay from the 60s called Irish Food Before the Potato. And it was basically saying that, the potato had leveled the diet, long before the famine, that the potato had been this kind of, ethnographic disaster, and had really bottomed out the variety in the food. And it was pointing out, before then, the diet used to be considerably more diverse. And if you look at medieval Irish food, it looks bewildering. But it's full of fermented products. Basically, it's full of essentially the kind of like kefir type stuff. And the Irish, they used to call it bonvia, white food. And there's a whole lot of fuss in medieval Irish literature about bonvia. Ireland ate heavily over-indexed amounts of dairy in comparison to the rest of medieval Europe. It's a very strange phenomenon. They ate considerably less beef and drank considerably more milk, and those things are have an obvious relationship. The cows were more valuable as dairy providers. And it's funny because my kind of mentoring professor and thesis advisor is an Irish food historian, and I remember he would give classes on the history of Irish food, and he would say, long before the potato or any of this other kind of stuff that passes for Irish food, the thing that like psychologically runs deepest in the kind of culinary psyche of the nation is this just thirst for whole fat butter, whole fat cream, whole fat milk. The amount of just like heavy dairy products that Ireland consumes, and that seems to have been a very, very long thread. And that kind of resonates when you tell it as a kind of a comic line. But what seems very distant is that, again, before a lot of this stuff was sour, and there was a whole thing among kind of various Irish chiefs that like the more refined your palate was, the sourer you liked your milk. And it's full of these like curd type products. And I knew one guy who was literally writing his thesis on lost words for cheeses, or they all would have been these kind of curd cheese. Well, not, who knows what all of them were. But for instance, in Irish mythology, Queen Maeve is killed by somebody slingshots a block of cheese to her head. And he was saying, well, this clearly must have been more of a Parmesan, it can't have been a mozzarella, this kind of damage. But how all of this loops back is Tudor colonists in Ireland consistently complain that Irish food, and particularly dairy, gives them the runs. They call it the flux. And it's blamed on the trifecta of red meat. The other big accusations the Irish ate very, very red meat, undercooked. The second is dairy, and this strange bonbia, the white foods, these kind of fermented dairy products. And the third is the weather, the damp, humid, and cold environments. And consistently, they also say that the Irish have a remedy for flux, which they call usquebaugh. And one of the first big cultural appearances of whiskey in Anglophone accounts is as a remedy for the shits. it's consistently described as like a diuretic, or not a diuretic, a kind of counter diuretic, something that's used to prevent the flux, and it's there from the roots. These are the kinds of connections that have been long lost at times. There's one thing, 70s powers is more of a recent memory, but some of the connections, and it did well up in Creator, and when I was looking, there's a lot of attention in kind of Irish cuisine at the moment about some of this medieval food, and it's become quite trendy to kind of reposition Ireland in kind of a almost orientalized, they used to eat a lot of seaweed in Ireland, and this kind of new Nordic cuisine context, and a lot of them have started looking back to these bizarre fermented products. It really was quite a strange food, and some of it survived for a long time, like if you ever come across Bonnie Clabber, actually Bonnie Clabber made its way to America, to like Appalachia, but the name is Bonnie Clabber, mud milk. And it's fermented, it's that same, the last strand of that surviving in kind of rural diets. But there was that attachment of, and Ireland is far from the only place, and whiskey is far from the only spirit, as a context for spirits to be treated as a kind of a digestive or a way of handling food. But it certainly lost that, maybe drinks like Armagnac or whatever have retained, that connection. But to this point, it's hard enough to convince people that food isn't ruining the whiskey. It's so far apart.
Well, so one of the things I wanted to ask you about, because I want to come back to talk about your crowdfunding project in a second. But the other day when we were speaking, something you said struck me a lot, which was we were talking about the near, well, I don't want to overstate it, but I think it's probably not overstating it to say the near collapse of Irish whiskey in the 80s into the 90s and stuff. That what it did is it created a vacuum where there's right now, not a generation of sort of elder statesmen of Irish whiskey. I mean, there's a few, but there's not a huge generation of these guys. So a lot of these younger distillers that are your age and, even younger, guys in their 20s, 30s, the old ones are 40, there's almost this, well, I think you made the analogy. It's like the sort of the kids are having a party while their parents are away. There's no parents about. There's no, you and I were speaking about Jim McEwen, and there's no Jim McEwen. There's not that generation. And I wanted to kind of, I thought I was really inspired by that. And I wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
Yeah, there is a strange, you have like Barry Crockett and people, but they're in a it's like literally Middleton or Bushmills or Noel Sweeney, and that's your, certainly on the production end, your elder statesman. But again, you have people like John Quinn in the marketing who have been there for a long time. But again, nothing in comparison headcount wise to Scotland. And there is that weird feeling of like, and of course the kind of guilty secret of the Irish industry is not enough distillers to go around, which is great for the distillers because they can kind of, get the payment conditions they want and the job offers they want, and there's a lot of ambition there and a lot of energy, and certainly I've had talks with a good few Scottish distillers who are working in Ireland who have commented on this and said, wow, back in the Scottish industry, you kind of wait for somebody to retire after 30 years and then you get their job, and this is kind of wait your turn and know your place. And in Ireland, you have this like, kind of brimming enthusiasm, this kind of lost boys type mentality. You get the Brendans of the world, and there is a strange, sense of optimism, and it's an odd. It feels in many ways more like the global craft industry for some of them than it does like the next door neighbor to Scotch whiskey. And for some others, it feels much more like the neighbor to Scotch whiskey than it does like the global craft industry. But there's a weird hybridity about what's going on, and certainly there's a very strong difference of opinion even within Ireland of what the industry is, or kind of how it should approach itself. And that's exciting, that's energizing, that's healthy,
Yeah, for sure. So I want to explain to people for a quick second. So the crowdfunding campaign goes live, I believe, in a half hour, correct? Right now it's going to be 1:00 California time. When we set this up, it hadn't dawned on us that Ireland is currently only 7 hours ahead of me right now, because in Europe they've turned their clocks back already, and we don't do it till this coming weekend. So there's this 1 week, well, there's 2 weeks a year that happens in the spring too, where we're off the normal amount. So this is going to go live in Ireland at 8 p.m., correct? There. Yeah. And so therefore to 1 p.m. to us, 4 p.m. on the East Coast of the US, if any of you are watching. I would love to give a quick rundown to people about what exactly it is people are crowdfunding. I mean, there's a book, but there's a lot more to it than just simply a book, right? I mean, you can kind of explain it, because I think, people would love to hear a little bit. And I think right now on the website, it will go live on that website. The site's live, but the specifics will go live in about a half an hour when we're wrapping this up. But in the meantime, we're relying on you.
Yeah, and and it's funny, I hadn't seen the website for a while. I saw a draft, and Marcus, the designer and photographer for the book, and Brian, who's been setting up the website, after a certain amount of being a nuisance to them, I've kind of left it to them. So people will see my eyes go wide when this goes live as well. But even then, they've done an amazing job. And again, yeah, it is a strange, like I wrote A Glass Apart, kind of while being a student. I was my original background. I was writing about hell, in kind of medieval texts. And
as you do.
Yeah, as you do. I love
Yes.
And I started doing this on the side, and it took quite a long time, and it was eaten out of having a certain kind of freedom. But for this book, partly, to kind of fund the book's creation, but also, of course, to take this as a serious project, and to afford myself and Marcus the time to not only take time aside to do this, but to travel an awful lot and to talk to a lot of people. And we kind of come to the decision, look, we have to find some way to do this, and we didn't want to take money off the industry. I had spoken, so Boan, when they had these thesis distillations, I didn't take any money off them at the time, but they did say at one point, look, would you like a cask? And so what we did instead was we gave the cask to Two Stacks, and Two Stacks are organizing this whole sale as a kind of a sponsorship on the back of this. So there, Boan didn't take a cut, Two Stacks haven't taken a cut. Whatever doesn't go to the tax man is paying for books, is paying for time, is paying for travel, is paying for all these ancillary costs, to give us the space to write this kind of book. Because the other thing that had happened early on was I talked to publishers, and usually the response I got was, well, that all sounds very nice, but what we'd really like you to write is a guide to Irish whiskey, reviews of top 100 on shelves and this kind of stuff. And, quite frankly, I didn't, again, those books can be fantastic and incredible, and go find them and read them. But they were not this. And, the whole idea of this was to create space for that kind of book, and to prove that there was an audience, and to bring people along. When we came up with this idea, it was also a way of sharing the liquid, and the process, because there's a lot of stuff that's not going to go in the book. These talks are like, in one of the chapters I will be talking to Paddy about that tuna and about the Seanariad Puchin, and have that as a chapter. But it'd be great, there's a lot more than can fit in a chapter there, and it'd be great to have some sort of a session, and all these kind of embers that'll come off the anvil along the way, all these talks, and I thought, well, hell, there's a space for this, and certainly, like, to add, so the whiskey itself is not, a bottle yet. It's 3 years old. It's not even 3. It'll turn 3 in December when the project starts. And there was that sense of like, well, okay, it'll become legal whiskey in a sense at the same time we start, and we'll pull from it a few live events. And when it becomes a 7-year-old, we'll bottle it, and that'll be the kind of end point. And the 7 is picked for a few reasons. One, it's just harkening back to what was a very common age statement in the 1940s and 50s among a lot of these Irish pot still mash bills. Old Powers was a 7-year-old, Old Cumber was a 7-year-old. The slogan of Jameson back when it was a pot still was not a drop sold till it's 7 years old. It's in a lot of mirrors, and the mash bill itself is from the 40s. It's from the Locks collection of the National Library. Anyone who wants to do the math, I don't want to piss off any modern brands, but you can work out. And it's 40% unmalted barley, 40% malt, 15% oats, and 5% rye. And it was the first mash bill during the thesis that I actually found in an archive. I'd seen some of them in old books and this and that, but the first one that was, and so there was a certain kind of allure. And I'd gone through heaps of the Locks collection kind of records, but most of them are sales receipts and kind of board meetings and this and that. And then there was one box that had all the day books. And so it had a kind of a romantic attachment from the start, but the idea was to, I wouldn't know what to do with a full cask anyway, to be honest. So it was a way of sharing that, of creating, the book is not about Boan or about Two Stacks. It's about so many different things and so many different people. And, with that up front that they had helped facilitate this, it gives us a space not to take money off of, whatever, and to be as independent as we can and breathe the free sea air and, and write the kind of book we want to write. And they, they both kind of understood that. And so it was a way of making it the project I wanted it to be, having it be, I see it as a thing of love. And if it was just me writing it in solitude, I don't know if that would ever exist. And so we, again, we thought, well, what can we do as a package? So it'll be, this series of events until the book is finished. We intend to write it next year and probably roll into a little bit of the next year. And the last event will be the book launch. And for those who can't make the live stuff, we'll have kind of quarterly online talks about, extremely niche topics, but stuff that I think, the kind of people who will be interested in this at all will be interested in, and talking about, how bases for grain whiskey from certain distilleries have been swapped out in different years or this or that, or talking about these kind of old manuscripts, old distilling texts, both like Irish language, kind of Gaelic medical manuscripts, and older European alchemical texts. I mean, weird stuff that doesn't make it into the whiskey sphere generally, but is the first, like certainly in a European context, that like the first hard references to spirits, are largely medical and alchemical. And I think there's a lot of thirst out there in the wider whiskey world for this kind of deeper and stranger terrain, and certainly even within the Irish stuff, I think there's always been a kind of a language barrier, both with Irish and with Scots Gaelic, of despite the fact that the word whiskey is an Anglicization, and there's this, despite the enormity of the love for Scotch, there's not a lot of people who would be able to tell you the kind of like references to whiskey in the Highland Bardic tradition. You'd get like Dave Broom and a couple of people would be into it, but it's only recently that it's kind of entered the public sphere, and Ireland even more so. And I wanted to get to that, dirty words for putching distilling. And there are, I mean, a lot of the stuff is pretty foul-mouthed because, of course, these were moonshiners essentially. But that's part of lived experience. That's part of culture as well. And these again, that whole space, I thought there was space for, and a lot of it stuff I don't know a whole lot about. So I wanted to get to talk to some. So for instance, the Irish stained glass artist Harry Clark, this kind of old, kind of, his windows look very kind of Baroque and strange, almost kind of fairy tale looking. And he did old ads for Jameson, and we'll find someone who can talk about that, or talk to Paddy Egan, who knows his stuff about the music element, or whoever. And to talk to farmers, that's another thing that whiskey has and I've seen this in America come back in a real ways, this like attachment to farm work, and that's been really inspiring to see people like use different strains of corn and this and that. But to a certain degree, you know, a lot of it had been kind of lost over here, or the immediacy of the connection, you know, and it has reasserted itself. But you know, to talk to people who grow barley for a living about that, or to talk to tillage researchers about strains, all of these people, I have a long list of people I would like to talk to for starters, and if I can get them to talk to a group, even better. And so that's part of it as well, is that whole on the road kind of experience, you know, to bring people along and to facilitate
Well,
that.
before we go even further into this, you mentioned foul-mouthed, deep, and weird, and I have a special guest I'd like to bring in who's probably all three of those things. I have to admit, I saw those coming up, and I saved those for a moment. But so we've started sharing the live feed of this with our friends at Whiskey Network, and the editor of Whiskey Network, Mark Pruitt, who's a whiskey writer and a friend of ours, is going to join us for a couple of minutes, and hopefully be a little bit deep, weird, and foul-mouthed. So I'd like to bring him into this conversation, if you don't mind. Hi.
Hey, I spent the last 10 minutes thinking of something really like professional and profound to say, and that's now gone all out the window.
Well, I saw you take your Halloween costume off. I was bummed.
Oh, do you want me to transform into the other Greg?
Yeah. Because I gave a lot of thought. I'm not going to lie. I gave a lot of thought beginning this podcast with my Halloween costume on, because my daughter has insisted that I be the Grim Reaper today. So I was wearing this earlier, but I decided to hell with it.
So I'm the real Greg Sports, and I reject this live broadcast by all means.
And can you see Chuck? Because I can't see Mark. I don't know if that's. But
I can see Mark.
Can you see Mark?
I don't know if people can see Mark. I saw Alphonse actually comment, and keeping your camera off is statement enough, but I can see Mark.
Thank you, Alphonse.
No, yeah. People are saying they can't see you, Mark.
Oh, well, that's too bad. I don't know what. My camera's on.
Yeah, black screen. People are saying it's just a black screen. Well, here, I'm going to take you out then and put you back in. Hold on. Well, I don't know if that's going to help at all. But yeah, I can see you fine. I could see you backstage.
I can see you too.
There, now I've switched. I've switched to the other view here. Fionnán, you may recognize that background. That background is the view from the Killowen Distillery.
Oh yes, yeah. Oh god.
I realize a bunch of deeply green bushes and trees and ivy is not going to narrow it down a lot in rural Ireland, but
yes, I know that hedge well. Many a time have I slept under that hedge. Yeah.
Okay, people are saying you're good now, so I'll stick with this until people tell me now I've screwed it up again and you're back. But you are a bit pixely. You look like you're in a 2006 Nokia flip phone, but other than that, I'll take it.
Sorry, I'm on a mobile connection. I apologize.
And I want you to feel free to be, profane and weird and dark. But wait, so before we get too far afield here, Fionnán was about to the big thing of the crowdfund. We haven't, well, not necessarily the big thing. The book is the big thing, but let's say the bait on the hook is the big thing, which is the other thing that will go with your crowdfund, which is
what haven't we gotten to? The book, the bottle,
the tipple.
Yes, so that itself, which will come last. So the plan is to bring people along for this kind of essentially whiskey club, and then when the book exists, they get the book, and they'll get their name in if they want it. If they want to abstain, that's fine. But there'll be a sponsors page at the back, to kind of thank them. And then when it's 7 years old, they'll get the bottle itself. It's an odd, so I have a kind of an emotional attachment to all the mashes, because they all came from weird bits of the thesis, or they all came from a bit of history. I found it interesting finding them in the first place. So, my views on their tastes are always warped by that. I would like to think Michael Walsh or any of the blind panelists, had a more, Michael didn't get to participate in the blind thing, obviously, because he had experience of what they were. But I'd hope that they're more on the ball. And certainly with this one, I remember when we got the responses back from the sensory panel, Michael was very nervous, and so was I. because we'd had all these logs. And he said, can you imagine if like the main takeaway from this is that you and I are a pair of frauds, and all our notes are wildly different from, but thankfully they were more or less, on shape. So they were a bit of relief. But with this particular mash, one thing that kind of drew me to it, I mean, a lot of the oats, gave this kind of almost like, in fact, one of the biggest sensory takings, one of the most obvious of them, probably the two most obvious, was that the higher the malt content, the more people responded that it was fruity, which is, something you'd expect. But oats is a bit more of a mystery. What's oats going to do? And one of the clearest results was as oats went up, there was one category where it said sweet, fruity, and there were examples beneath, and there was sweet, non-fruity. And everything had to be. We borrowed a system from the Scotch Whisky Research Institute, and you're trying to make something highly subjective as objective as possible. So you get very little wiggle room. You get these set categories, and then 0 to 3, 0 being not detectable, and 3 being extremely detectable. And so it's to avoid somebody's 7 being somebody's 5, and blah blah blah. And even within that space, sweet, non-fruity, which was, and then in parentheses, icing, sugar, glycerin, vanilla. That spiked very, very clearly. And so a lot of the oatier ones had that kind of, caster sugar kind of smell to them. That very kind of almost like gelato-y mix of kind of creaminess and that kind of sweet, non-fruity in the mouth. But this had something a little quirky. This had this like almost, and it must have been that 5% rye mixing with that. And you got this like dragon fruit kind of nectar, and there was something a little like exotic fruit style sour about it, kind of keeping it on its toes. And I just found that so alluring and so strange. And it was, it was 40% malt. Some of them went higher on the malt content, some of them went lower. Raw barley, in an Irish context, raw barley is a very signature grain. Obviously, anyone who's had like a red breast, and it's already attributed for that kind of gingery, almost kind of gingerbread meets kind of raw licorice meets a kind of a hedgy kind of taste, and then that kind of infamous oil, that kind of mouth coating sensation. And so that worked with the oats well itself. But this had that. But there's other tastes that I recognize from, and this was based, so for instance, if we double distilled it, we would have gotten presumably stronger differences. But we had to have triple distillation because it had to be modeled off of contemporary market standard pot still. So, there were 2 controls put into the sensory panel. It had to be a kind of a new make redbreast type deal. But even within that space, there were some of them, especially where the raw barley went up, where they had notes that I would kind of treasure in contemporary pot still from mature distilleries, kind of Middleton style stuff. And one of those notes is this kind of bizarre, like not felt tip marker, but like peach fuzz kind of smell. And that was there definitely. So there were bits of it that were familiar, but then instead of like peach fuzz, you were getting this like nectarine, and everything was slightly sour, more exotic, pomegranate, that kind of stuff. And then it had this like tinned peaches kind of smell off of it, which is really grown up. So it's in a sherry, first fill Oloroso sherry cask. And I was wondering if that would kind of stomp it out. Another reason for having it be a 7-year-old is I didn't want to be so old that, the mash is less discernible. Of course, it'll always be somewhat discernible, but, I wanted it to be young enough that the mash is still a very strong part, a very clear part of what's doing the loud talking. And in sherry, I was thinking, well, how I know from historical examples that mash will still be loud. But anyway, trying it, it had definitely picked up this like strong, that vanilla from the oats, that weird nectar had turned into this like tinned pear, tinned peaches kind of syrup smell. I used to drink that stuff as a child, and my mother would catch me like, if we got tinned peaches, like slurping it out of the bowl. And anyway, I actually went and bought a tin of peaches when I was trying to sample, just to see if the love was still there, or if this was on theme. And it still got that. And then instead of a lot of Boan, there's the other strange thing. People talk about distillery character a lot in malt whiskey. People talk about like Clynelish being waxy or Caol Ila being oily. And you're kind of calling a bluff when you're, and of course, this would be more familiar in an American context as well. With when you're working with different mashes and like, well, what's the house character when you've got a lot of stuff coming off of one still, and certainly if there is a house character to Boan, a lot of the kind of core pot still they do has this almost kind of pumpkin taste to it. It's a kind of a gourd kind of taste. It's a very peculiar, very kind of subtle thing, but it's the strongest differentiation I've found between it and kind of Middleton style pot still. And this has that as well. That strange, like instead of being quite oily, it's like a fleshiness. It's still a big Irish pot still style mouthfeel, but that kind of generosity is less oil and more like actual like biting into a fleshy fruit. But again, even beyond peaches, like something with a bit of stringiness in it. That kind of again like gourdy feeling. So there was a lot in there that I loved, and there's a chapter in the book called Soup, Syrup, or an Electuary to Cure the Disease, which is all the chapters in the book are named after throwaway lines from archival stuff, and we hope that His Majesty's good subjects will aid in the discovery of private stills or whatever. They're all riffs on from the excise or this or that, but anyway, this particular line is from an Irish medical manuscript from 1460, actually. So it's a translation of an Irish line. But it's an insertion by a scribe. There's a text called the Lilium Medicinae that went all over Europe. So the Lily of Medicine, and then it got other names like the Rosa Medicinae and the Rosa Anglica, which is the English version, and blah blah blah. Anyway, this is ultimately a line, an insertion into a description from the Lilium Medicinae, and the Irish scribe has added in a description of distillation of aquavita, which he's translated to Ushkabaha. It may be taken as in soup, syrup, or an electuary, as in like cut with honey, to reduce the disease. It doesn't actually say what the disease is, So this kind of cryptic throwaway, but there's a chapter in there about these manuscripts. It's also describing what spirits are, and what I love about spirits in premise. And that line really struck me. Syrup is something that's been condensed, and soup being that old connection to food, and then to reduce what do they do to us? They slightly reduce, they make life a little more bearable. They reduce the disease, and that's the chapter where this will go, absolutely, because it does smell like syrup. And so it'll be in the book as a part of it. There is a chapter where it makes an appearance, and to give that, I wanted it to. Obviously the book is not about this whiskey or even the thesis. It's meant to be a bit more generous to that and to talk to distillers across Ireland. But this is very much the bottle of the book. Absolutely.
I was in Ireland in April, and one of the fascinating things to me was going on distillery tours and going to the whiskey museum. And I remember asking the question, like, what's distinct about the barley? Well, or what the grains that you use, because usually when you talk about whiskey, there's this long, eloquent story of where the grains came from. We revived it from the tomb of an unknown soldier 10,000 years ago, and there's this great story. And they said, well, it's just grain. We just go and we grab the grain and we throw it into the stills. And I what's fascinating to me about this is this satisfies that curiosity of where does this stuff come from, and it begins to sort of tap into that the craft nature of what Irish whiskey could become as a part of the revolution that's beginning now. You and I had a very fascinating conversation, and you've recounted a lot of those details. This was just the other day, and I'm glad I got to join you, because I just wanted everybody to know that Whiskey Network is going to be getting something out there initially. You sent me 3 emails that were so full of information. I probably spent 2 hours going through all of that stuff, and it truly is, if you're a whiskey geek, this is where you want to be. You want to be looking at this stuff. It doesn't matter whether you like Irish whiskey or not. It's going to satisfy the whiskey geek in you, because it's just so in depth and there's so much information to cull out of this. So we'll get something initial out there. Where can you find information about the crowdfunding? And then my commitment is, in the very near future, we'll do something a little more in depth to where we can get together with you and we can put some additional information out there. But this is just the really deep end of the pool, and it is incredibly fascinating.
Well, yeah, thank you. And again, I felt the same, and I think a number of people, and this isn't just, I feel this in Scotland as well. There has been a certain kind of it'll do fine attitude running far too long in whiskey. We make it this way with this set fermentation time with distiller's yeast and this, and our product is already inherently the best, and stop asking questions.
They made a bigger deal about saying the Irish did it for 3 years and 1 day.
Oh, right.
And the Scots people did it for just 3 years.
Right, which is also not true. There's nothing in legislation whatsoever that says 3 years and a day. It's all bullshit.
Well, the ugly American bought it hook, line, and sinker. They had their hooks in me right away.
Yeah. Oh, what nonsense. And even for both of them, that legislation was brought in by Lord Lloyd George, a teetotaler in 1915, as a way of cracking down on grain whiskey. Back when the column still was really upping the amount of alcohol on the streets. This was one of the few kind of boons the kind of pot still purists got in their losing war with the inevitable tide of grain whiskey and the blends that it facilitated. Was they got this, in fact, I remember looking through some books that were to do with column distillers, Royal Irish Distillery in Belfast, and in their board meetings, they're horrified. They're thinking, holy crap, 3 years, we're going to be out of business. We don't have anything older than a year. And a lot of grain whiskey was very, very young, if even a year. And so, the whiskey industry collectively was dragged kicking and screaming to be 3 years old in the and there was a lot of lobbying coming out of the Central Belt of Scotland, DCL and people who did not want this to happen. And now they have the audacity to all come along and, it's a matter of pride. We could never bear, so there is that side of it. And I think it's healthy to have a certain kind of bullshit thermometer at the best time, because there is a lot, out there. And look, I'm a romantic about this at heart, but at the same time, that romance, you want to be burning off of a genuine flame, rather than kind of smoke and mirrors, as best you can,
Well, you've captured my imagination, because you and I are going to collaborate on an article it's going to be titled the dirty words used to describe poachine or something to that effect, because that's a side project that we need to do, because I'm fascinated by that.
Oh yeah, it's Bud and Rama. Do you want me to? What's our viewer demographic? The the old word for a worm coil, Bud is penis, Oscaliga, and it was literally the dribbling dick. The trickle that would come off, and some of this stuff, again. But that's utter as much a part of lived experience and of organic, real culture of whiskey as was elegiac poetry talking about how wonderful it is to have a dram, and I feel that very deeply, that this is all part of the story, and that there is a complexity there, and there is a tactile feeling to that, and it's not just a history. Again, a lot of it is about contemporary distilling, and that same attempt to get, I would love to talk to people who do gas chromatography and looking at ways of getting our fingers in the dirt, about what this stuff is. And if I can bring people along to kind of, share in that kind of banter, I'll be delighted. The book will be a pleasant kind of, byproduct of a lot of fun. Not that
there's a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Fionnán. You may have come across him, named Patrick McGowan.
Okay, no.
And he is a culinary anthropologist, and he's done a lot of work with brewers. I don't know that he's done anything with distillers yet, but he's done a lot of work with brewers where they'll travel the world. They briefly had a TV show here about 10, 12 years ago now. I think the TV show was a year or two ahead of itself. It would have been a huge hit had it come later, where they knew that they had a brewer's recipe from a beer that was made for the coronation of a Finnish king in 17 something, and they would go recreate it. And then they would travel around and sort of recreate these ancient beer recipes using like, molecular scans of vessels that had held beer versus occasionally documents, but also occasionally gas chromatography and all kinds of stuff. And, he doesn't look or act like Indiana Jones, but he's sort of like the beer Indiana Jones, which is arguably better because he's also real.
No, it's something I'm very interested in. There's somebody working that closer to home, Susan Flavin, and she, I remember having a chat with her, and her big discovery, you always hear that, well, they drank a lot of beer in Europe in the Middle Ages, safer than water, but it was all very mild. And her conclusion was, actually, no, the mild beer was roughly the strength of modern normal beer. Then there was another form of beer that was stronger again. And the small beer was actually like roughly the strength of a Heineken. But yeah, I just got a text there that said "Site Live." I've been doing my best not to.
Oh, nice. Well, yes, it is. It's 1:00. All right. Let me see. I'm reloading the site on my page right now. Bingo. It is live. So there you go, people. If anyone is seeing this, I will. The link is on the screen, but I'm also going to post it in the chat, so it'll be an active link. And I will tell you the second that we get off of this, I'm going to go be one of your crowdfund supporters. I'm really truly moved and excited by what you're doing. And I was so happy. Like I said at the beginning of this, I met you for the first time when I went to Ireland last year with Carrie Moynihan, who I know is watching today, for her podcast. And but I'd heard about you prior to that and what you were doing. And then now this is sort of, you have to forgive the pun, has been distilled down into an actual specific project, not just a sort of body of work. But the distillation comes from now I've emptied my Dram in a can. So it's 50 mils. Yeah. Oh, 100 mils.
And again, an enormous amount of, they don't get nearly enough credit. I mean, the Two Stacks lads, whom I know have put in an enormous amount of work behind the scenes, getting this into shape. It would have been absolutely impossible without them. And again, Boan with their largesse donating the cask in the first place, not to mention the project. So there is, it has been a labor of love, and the flowering of a lot of different labors of love, and a lot of kind of half-started conversations that I'd like to finish, conversations I've had with people over the years, odd stuff that came up, again, back to that kind of agricultural stuff, I kept coming across a term, maslin, for mixed agriculture, for grains grown in tandem, especially in an Irish and British context, wheat and rye grown in a shared field, which had been originally just, they seem to do better in winter, grown together. They support each other, which we're now coming back to for like sustainability reasons. People saying, oh, but this was just farmers' know-how before. And of course, they were inseparable as flour because they were grown, inseparably. And so you get like maslin bread in France and this and that. But I started seeing it pop up in mash bills, and it changed how I started thinking about mash bills, if they're even, they're not even really bills. That, again, it's this kind of slanted mirror of agriculture. The reason oats are such a big part of Irish whiskey was have to do with the fact that they were the predominant cereal on the island. Again, these forces become inseparable. They become, and it's funny. Like, for instance, one of the big hammered home points of the thesis, something I have gotten wrong in the past and put in print incorrectly. The kind of received wisdom in Ireland for the origin of single pot still was that it had been a way of kind of foxing the malt tax. The use of raw barley had been, I'm sure you would have heard that in the whiskey, visitor center. And it all turned out not to be true. Like, I was looking through the resources, and it was all there 100 years before the malt tax was even passed in Ireland. And not just that, the malt tax, when you read it, actually illegalized raw barley in an effort to get all the ingredients taxed, and then that was done away with in 15 years. But it had nothing to do with anything. And kind of where I started following this lead was, eventually one of the central arguments of the thesis is that the use of raw grains was a product of direct-to-farmer commerce, where you had distillers literally just buying grains on an open agricultural market off of farmers, and rather than from maltsters. And when they were still of a size where they didn't do the malting themselves, you got a lot of them just literally processing these in tandem and buying malt from maltsters. And then, you get this kind of intermediate. So when you're tiny, you just malt yourself, the poaching level of, just stick it in a river and do it on your own. And when you get very big, you can have a malting floor and a proper pagoda and whatnot. But there's a lot of this stuff in the middle, and you start seeing this kind of, and this line that kept coming up: the distillers are the farmer's friend. And every time there was a kind of a temperance, prohibitionary statement, that wouldn't be great if we drank a little less gargle. The thing the distillers always say is, we're subsidizing the farmers, because in a good year, grain becomes very cheap, and the farmers can not just lose money, but possibly swing back to pasture and swing back to away from tillage in the first place and go back to like cows and sheep, which can be very dangerous.
Sure.
And so it's a way of when years are bad, you need there to be a lot of grain. And the distillers were, even if it wasn't true or how true it was, they certainly present this argument very, very strongly that we subsidize the farmer. And so you get this strange, and so single pot still really grew up out of kind of urban spaces and market towns. There's a reason it was so associated with Dublin and Cork City, and then kind of larger, more prosperous market towns in the Midlands, because there's where you had harvest markets. And then when you look in remote areas, if you're just doing it with your own immediate resources, it's much more likely that you will just take one thing, probably barley because it's the best, but also oats, and I say best in terms of effect, it has the most diastatic, power of the gang, drown it and dry it. And that's the origin of, when you're talking about where does single malt culture come from? And you have that, what happened in the Highlands did not happen in Ireland. There's a lot of cross-pollination that goes on, and it's really a matter of varying. It's like a historical jigsaw puzzle as to why, Donegal isn't covered in licensed, single malt distilleries. And even when Irish whiskey was doing well, it wasn't. There's just a lot of illicit distilling, whereas the Highlands were kind of, ushered into this kind of at least semi-industrialized, space. Talisker is not a wee little still in the hills. These are distilleries, and they have been for some time. And so that's part of it as well, is trying to get to the bedrock. And so that was, the thesis was really a lot of that. And for me, the thesis, to a certain extent, when I started looking at this as the next project, the thesis became a way of kind of earning the right to say certain things. Another big myth held to task in the thesis that Irish whiskey was distilled by monks, of which there is absolutely no proof whatsoever. I mean, nothing. And not just no proof, it would necessitate heavily backdating all of the evidence by centuries. You kind of have to earn the right with research and proof to kind of say this kind of stuff. But then afterwards, there's a certain freedom to talk more enthusiastically and more glibly about how all of this can inform the present, or what can be drawn, or how they connect. So, the joy, the book, I anticipate writing the book being an absolute joy. It's something I look forward to very, very strongly. The thesis is kind of coming to its end, natural terminus at the end of this year, and then Creator starts.
I'm happy to say that while you were answering that question, Fionnán, I went and I signed up for, and also I saw Michael Caldwell signed up for the crowdfund.
Oh, Jesus.
So it's happening.
As soon as I get home, I was
able to do it very easily. I don't know if you could hear the dinging and pinging, but it was super easy. It took 2 clicks. It took 2 clicks and I'm in. Look, I'm one of the things that getting to know you has helped me do is call bullshit on people that are happy to respout, and no fault to them, because they've been fed it for decades. But just the other day after we spoke, I was speaking with Brad, the cinematographer from The Water of Life, one of my good friends, and he said, "Oh, about the unmalted barley and it's a tax," and I was like, no. And so, I got to dunk on one of my friends. That's the lesson of this, is I got to dunk on one of my friends.
Victories, I'm that's what drives me, wakes me up in the morning. It's just putting in a footnote. Yeah. Unfortunately, that's eerily a little close to the bone. But it's difficult, and I think a lot of people don't mean it. They would tell a more earnest. I think there is a lot of. Certainly, I can only really speak for the Irish industry, but there is a lot of sincerity among brand ambassadors and people coming into it and this and that, and they don't want. Nobody likes being wrong. and then you get brands that have kind of invested heavily in a myth, and that's where it gets much more awkward, to tell people some. And then there's some who know it's wrong, but they've cashed in the poker chips already with their branding and sometimes even their names, and there's no going back, and that's where I lose time for people. That's where it just becomes disingenuous.
I'm paraphrasing here, but not by much. When we were making The Water of Life, Jim McEwen said something to me on the very first day of shooting about distilling companies that have not paid attention to their own past. They can't be bothered with their own real history. And he said, if they don't have anything real to say, then they all of a sudden come up with some story about a unicorn that peed in a well and a princess came back to life. And then the next thing you know, there's a whole new story.
Absolutely. And it's strange. I think world whiskey deserves more, and is getting there. Certainly there has been a difference of approach, and it's like watching clay crack. It's baking in the sun, and it seems like it'll never splinter. But then you look at when it's been doing it a while, and it's all kind of dissolved. And you look at these stories again. Scotland has its like down the Rushy Glen type spiel, and I had great conversations. Like for instance, Derek Bratt. I don't know if you've come across Derek. He was writing his PhD on illicit distilling archaeological sites in the Highlands. He was like literally uncovering sites. He's with the University of Highlands and Islands, and I got in touch with Derek because we were the only two people I knew of doing whiskey history PhDs. And he was talking about the way that Scotch whiskey tells the story of illicit distilling. It's all kind of romanticized, and the kind of gritty lived experiences / violence / social complications is there's so much more there, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. There is a romance. There is again that it was so woven into people's lives, that it was an agricultural activity, and we're coming back to a lot of this stuff. And similarly, the people of long ago, or the brand ambassadors and distillers and what have you today, they'll be when we're all turning to clay ourselves, they'll be the past. It was just ourselves back then. And so there is that sense of their experiences matter as well. Absolutely.
Have you come across a book called Peat, Smoke and Spirit by Andrew Jefford?
Yes, I have. And I liked that his was as much kind of social history or social experience on the island. But so I spoke with him a little bit. Jim introduced me to him, and I spoke with him a little bit. And he actually declined to be in The Water of Life because he said, I have not followed the industry since I wrote the books. He said, I'm so far removed from it, I don't think I'd have anything to add, which I respected. Most people would jump at the chance to sort of massage their own vanity. But one of the things that's in that book that he and I spoke about, there's a little passage about Ardbeg being one of the few distilleries in Scotland that has never suffered a fire or any sort of catastrophic loss, and therefore had all of their original records. But in the late 90s, when they reopened, they were using old documents and laminating them, and on the other side of it would be the menu for the cafe that they'd opened. And they were sort of, so you'd read, like you'd look at the cafe menu of what you were, a sandwich or soup or coffee or whatever, and on the back of it, it was actually a receipt of the distillery truck ran over this farmer's cow, and so they paid them in whiskey to compensate for the dead cow. And so he said he actually talked to them and said, you need to stop doing this. You need to save these. These are amazing, and they're incredibly rare because most distilleries tend to lose these things over time. And and there might be small. The history's not this big, grand, unicorns and dragons, but it's amazing in its own right. Yeah, and again, there was that, especially like industrial history by a lot of archives, is seen as kind of last in the pecking order of what's worth preserving. That's been a big frustration for me, is, like nobody cared. This was the gritty receipts. If anything, they wanted to hide them from the government, not surrender them to posterity, and to know that they were defrauding X whatever engineer on some given day. And that can make it very difficult, but there wasn't that esteem in a lot of places, and you see some distill, obviously like Diageo have an archive, Irish distillers have an archivist, Carol. She's been a wonderful friend of the thesis, absolutely. And the whiskey industry feels closer to it than quite a lot of industries, but there was certainly a lot lost and a lot mistreated and a lot, not considered important. And even from what's there, you get this sense. And I think the biggest myth of all is that there's these kind of set whiskey categories, that there's like, the history of Irish pot still, the history of single malt, the history of grain whiskey, the history of bourbon. And then when you look, kind of peel the rock up, and you see like any given person on a different day said, like, fuck it, I'd like to try this. And, or some wonky, like the amount of like dead ends in the history of the column still, of like these continuous stills that look like something out of Dr. Seuss, of like descending pots and this and that, the history is made of individuals, and it isn't just this like collective kind of unfolding domino. And unfortunately, like for too long, the history of the like weird like she still and all these kind of bizarre contraptions has kind of gone by the wayside in favor of like, there was Aeneas Coffee, or better yet, there was Robert Steen, and in fact it was neither of them. But these kind of set stories, and the idea that they're kind of like almost like categories of whiskey, or like Euclidean geometry. There's like, this is a rhombus and this is a circle. These things have always been and shall always be. And and you look beneath the surface, and then it can make certain brands uncomfortable. I think I've mentioned to one or both of you at least that there's one distillery in Ireland that makes quite a big kind of USP about, in fact, fuck it, I'll say it, the Bushmills. Bushmills used to have advertisements, the old advertisements for Bushmills in the Belfast newsletter, and this all say turf flavor, that classic Bushmills peat flavor, and it's underlined too. And, again, and it was double distilled. And the fact that, all of these things have changed, but people develop ideas about what something should be. They take the modern product and project backwards, and I think they deserve better. And if I can, and a lot more of that is in the thesis, proper. A lot of that kind of like old ads, because there I'm trying to prove a point. And
that brings up a fascinating question that I wanted to ask you, but I want to be respectful of our time. But and maybe this is just a yes or no of something that may appear in the book or in your research. When I was in Ireland, it was very subtle, but there was definitely I like how everybody's drinking while I'm talking. Should I talk more so you guys can sip more? There's a regional division in Ireland on a lot of fronts. And I guess my question is Greg and I were actually talking, and he said at one point in the 80s, when Irish whiskey was on its last legs, there were literally 2 distilleries in Ireland, and they had a lot of different labels underneath them, but it was Bushmills and it was Jameson, and everything sort of spiderwebbed out from that. In your research, is there a true difference in where it was made in Ireland to how the whiskey tastes, and is that coming back? Is there more to that?
Do you mean north or south, or do you mean
yes,
sure, or just regionality in general, not political regionality, right? Yeah. Geographic regionality. Political
regionality, no. Okay. Other than the fact that like Belfast had quite a strong column, but like Cumber was single pot still, and and again, a lot of this, by the time the partition was in 1921, a lot of them had gone to wall by then anyway. Sure. And of course, like there were 2 distilleries, Jameson or Middleton and Bushmills, owned by one company at the same time. Like from the 70s onwards, it was IDL. IDL only later sold Bushmills, but for good. I mean, IDL was formed when Cork Distillers, i.e. Paddy, Powers, and Jameson became one company in 1960, between 66 and 68. And then I think 1972 they began the process of acquiring Bushmills. And certainly there's an example of like the old industries. You take like Billy Layton, who's the master blender for Middleton. Billy is from just up the road of Bushmills, and for years was the Bushmills master blender, but again transitioned within what had been the same company before the split. So a lot of that, so in that sense, no. But in terms of regionality, like you have to look, that's the other thing, you have to look very far back to find that kind of crack in Ireland. So like once upon a time, you have the idea that like column distilling was very much an industrialized northeastern belt. Dundalk to Belfast is where you really found that, and then out, say, as far as Derry, with the Watts distillery. But it's no surprise that was the industrialized part of the island. But then even there you got, there was only one pure pot still distillery in Belfast. That was the Cromac distillery. The rest, Avenel, Connswater, Royal Irish, all whomping big columns, looked a lot more like what was happening with the DCLs and whatnot over in Scotland. Malt whiskey, for the most part, and this is always one that's very difficult to approach because it's wrapped up in a lot of people's branding. But like the history of malt distilling in most parts of Ireland is really the history of illicit distilling. From the time people, by the time they started differentiating the two, which is in the 1820s, pure malt whiskey accounted for less than 3% of legal Irish whiskey, and it doesn't get much higher than that. I usually say nothing more than 5%, but it's really closer to nothing more than 3%, and all of it in Ulster. So again, there was that. But what's funny is like the Ulster distilleries, that single malt tradition that's happening in the north at that time is also very, very peaty, and what it's strongly reflecting is Donegal and the illegal. There's very little licensed distilling happening in Donegal. But Donegal was famous for pure malt peated whiskey, almost like the closest Ireland came to kind of Glenlivet, in the sense that even if you were nowhere near the Glenlivet, you would refer to yourself as Glenlivet. And similarly, like Bushmills, which is nowhere near Inishowen, its all adds say Inishowen flavor. Coleraine, nowhere near Inishowen, but both of them are in Ulster. Inishowen flavor. So there's an example of a lost regionality. And I know like certain distillers, like Jim Doherty up in Slieve League is very keen to kind of reassert that Donegal peat inheritance. But this is like deep history. This is long. When the number's been reduced to 2, and all it was IDL almost rationalizing the malt whiskey comes out of Bushmills, the pot still and the grain comes out of Middleton.
Consolidation killed the variety. That there you go. That's what the answer is.
Yeah, before IDL acquired Bushmills, so there had been the Coleraine distillery, which was originally a malt distillery, and then they were taken over by Bushmills, and Bushmills put columns into Coleraine and started making grain whiskey for themselves. And when they became part of IDL, the closure of Coleraine became inevitable. So there's an example of weirdly enough, the grain. In fact, I think we said this on the website as somewhere. Maybe it's gone now, but one of the topics is about the old Blackbush taste. And Blackbush was originally made with Coleraine grain mixed with Bushmills malt. And the Coleraine grain was being fed on Bushmills' own resources. So it was actually a barley-based column distilled grain whiskey. And there's a product made in Middleton, an infamous, kind of a quiet product that is still contract distilled, or contract supplied to Bushmills, that goes into Blackbush, it doesn't go into Whitebush. And one of the reasons why, in my humble opinion, Whitebush is a fairly, grim product, and Blackbush is just such an amazing whiskey. It's just kind of gorgeous and probably the best value whiskey in Ireland. But they have fundamentally, unless it's changing, fundamentally different grain whiskey bases. But part of that is this like threadbare legacy of when Coleraine was closed, it became necessary to create a grain whiskey base that resembled what had been closed, and this and that. And you can see, so there's a lot of these much more recent histories that are, in danger of being lost. Now Bushmills are, in the process of building their own columns. Who knows what will that be the end of the barley-based product? I don't know. Will it just revert to a kind of a maize product? I mean, and you look at that's happened even within grain whiskey, both in Ireland and Scotland. Grain whiskey has become a very simple, like, this one's made of wheat and maybe a little bit of diastatic Kickstarter malt. This one's made of maize, maybe a little bit of diastatic Kickstarter malt. Whereas if you look back into the history, even the kind of what is whiskey trial, and you see some of the column still mash bills they put forward, and they're wonky as all hell. They're like maize mixed with oats, mixed with rye, because they're originally the column stills were fed on the international grain market. There was the most cynical. When you had a kit that was capable of producing a more neutral and a lighter product, mash bills became less necessary, and you're seeing this just, again, absorbing of a whole lot of weird stuff that goes on, and that's part of the history as well.
I find this all fascinating because I know Mark has heard me say this, but I don't know that you've heard me say this, Fionnán. But my personal whiskey journey, I was an exchange student in Glasgow, I was 19. I started drinking whiskey. I would not honestly admit that I was appreciating whiskey. The first whiskey I ever really appreciated and took seriously was Irish whiskey, because 3 years after I was an exchange student in Glasgow, I just moved to Dublin, and I started drinking. And the first whiskey on which I hung my hat was Paddy, which is, you know, a funny whiskey to like for me to say, oh, I took it very seriously. But I have a personal policy that I'm never ever without a bottle of Paddy. Now, because at the time you couldn't buy it in the States. So my friend Kevin, whenever I would see him or he would come visit me, he would always bring me a bottle. There's a lot of really funny photos of Kevin at my wedding where it's me and Kevin posing, holding 2 bottles of Paddy as if they're our newborn twins. Because that was my wedding gift from Kevin, was for him to bring a bunch of Paddy to my wedding. And so that was really the first whiskey I took seriously and like kind of immersed myself in the story of, and, you know, and it's a funny whiskey to have done that too. You know, it's not exactly.
No. I mean, yeah, the last time I had Paddy was actually on Isla, and only because I walked into the bar and the bartender, you know, I was there. I was with Michael, the thesis.
Yeah.
And we were there, and we'd been, you know, we were there for a week. Michael had actually just left Boan, and you know, we were signed up for a gig with the Edinburgh Whiskey Academy, do these kind of talks. And on the back, we basically took what we were given by them on, you know, on the back of the payment, went to Ireland, spent it all on this, and then took the little ferry back to Antrim. And anyway, we'd been drinking Islay whiskey all week, and then we walked into a bar. You know, I forget the name of it. It's the one on the south end in Port Ellen, right on the dock. And the guy said, "Oh, well, you're from Ireland. Oh, I've got something just for you." And we, you know, he actually gave it to us for free, and we didn't have the heart to say, like, not only did we not come here to drink Irish whiskey, we certainly didn't come here to drink Paddy. And he you know, clearly had no idea what it was, and he was being very respectful of the whole thing. He said, "Oh, do you want a bit of water with that? Do you want, you know, this and that? You know, is this?" Anyway, but so that the last time I had Paddy was on. But I mean, there's, you know, exciting. And it's funny, like the old Cork Distiller stuff was class, you know. Again, the
sure, yeah, Paddy was different back then than it was now. But now I feel like it's the reason I brought it up is because it's always been this distillery, or it's been a brand without a home. And now I know they're building a home. I believe in Donegal, right? Or if not Donegal, Sligo, yeah. But Connacht, either way.
Yeah, there was a joke, because, you know, it's the old Cork Distillers Company, very associated with Cork, and there's I think it was Bill Annan, an Irish journalist, and he was kind of joking online. He said, "Just give it a few weeks and you'll start hearing his work often brought him to Sligo, which he affectionately called his real home." You know, the story to, you know, to link them together. But yeah, there's a lot. I mean, of course, like America's more used to that with all these like Pennsylvania brands made in Kentucky. You know, the this kind of strange blur of geography.
You know, it's funny. It's because I'm from Pennsylvania originally, and when I was in Kentucky last year, I was sort of almost half reluctant to bring that up. I actually met with Stephen Beam, who is a descendant of Jim Beam, and Brad, who was with me, was also Pennsylvania, and we said, "Oh, you know, we heard this story about Jim Beam's connection to Pennsylvania," and I have to admit, inside of myself, I kind of crouched, like I was expecting them to say bullshit, completely made up, and they said, "No, completely true." Completely true. Moved from Pennsylvania to Maryland, and then from Maryland to Kentucky, and took this whole whiskey rebellion, blah blah blah, whole thing. You know, fled into the wilderness, which Kentucky was at the time, and so blah blah. You know, but I was really pleased because I have to admit I was cringing, waiting for them to dispel the yet another myth from my youth.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, usually, like, you know, old overhaul things, it's just so easy to find that, you know, they're but again, yeah, Ireland. I mean, it's strange. Like, Ireland's got that too, you know, a kind of, and some of them are more earnest than others. You know, like when I look at, say, Dunville's up at Ecklandville, that revival, you know, Jarlath and co do really kind of feel an attachment to this. But then similarly, there's a load of them that, you know, it's just the recycling of old brands and kind of in search of a tale. And everything in between. And there is a loss of, and that was another reason I didn't want to do just like a survey book of Irish whiskey. I got to a certain point where there were just too many people who lied to me or said bullshit or thought we're disingenuous. And I don't really, I woke up one day, I thought, I don't have to listen to any of this crap. I can just write a book with the people I want to talk to, and from both the small and the large. There's a lot of sincere people doing interesting things, and there's a lot of conversations I've been having that really excite me, and let's just do that. And again, sail out to sea and breathe the free sea air, and leave the rest of them screaming at the shore, or probably, ambivalent to the shore, not paying any attention to what I'm doing. Proper order.
Well, I'm aware of the fact that we've been talking for an hour and a half now, and we're live now. And I hope that the crowdfund is doing well. I have no way of knowing myself. Yeah, I've not heard anything from anyone. No one's written to me saying it's crashing, but I just loaded it here. It is live, but I'm going to go, a little bit later. I'm going to go to trick or treating with my children, smelling of Irish whiskey. Here, our friend and collaborator, we all know him, Fawn, says, listening to Fionnán's stories of lost history and hidden respect reminds me of listening to Jack Herrera tell me stories many years ago. Awesome stuff, gents. Best of luck with the project.
Thank you.
And here, and Carrie Moynihan, speaking of friends, we all know Carrie's going to be getting involved in the crowdfund. I promise you, anyone who's been watching this from beginning to end has already sort of had a bit of a masterclass in Fionnán O'Connor storytelling, and I think that you'll get a good bit of that in hedge school. You might learn some good cataclysm and some along the way. But no, in all seriousness, it'll be an ongoing process, I'm sure, and it'll be fun and educational and exciting and different and unique, and at the end of the day, delicious. And I have to admit, I finished an entire tin of I guess that's 4 drams for me then. So, but Fionnán, I know you're heading back home tomorrow. Is it?
Yeah, tomorrow. Yeah.
Well, we will continue to promote and publish things about the crowdfund as it goes. I know I think you're going to be in good hands, because I think it's the real deal. And I always, when I hear that, I always hear Mark Renier's voice from our film. This is it. This is the real deal. This distillery from 1 mile up the road. But in any case, I think that you guys, what you're doing is really cool, and I think you're really a big part of the resurgence of Irish whiskey over the last decade. I mean, and the decade to come. It's one of the things I did not get to ask you, actually, before I let you go. I'm sorry, I'm going to throw this in now. Someone told me, there's whiskey with an E versus whiskey without an E, and I don't care about that. What I care about is this. Someone told me that you can tell an American distillery was founded by a Scot versus an Irish immigrant, whether they use the E or not. And that,
all that story, having spent an awful lot of time with 1809 excise reports and whatnot, you start seeing how inconsistent the word has always been. And all of these, both, you see it spelled K-E-Y all the time, Scottish excise reports and the other, and it was the standard spelling in Ireland for Paddy was K-Y into the 70s, and you hear all these kind of fantasies about the Dublin distillers wanted to separate there and this and that, and it all, and anyone who's dealt with any amount, I think one thing doing any archival research of any kind teaches you very fast is, for the vast majority of human history, people didn't know how to spell. I still don't know how to spell, but autocorrect will sort it out for me, and especially jargon words. So the idea of it being an Irish thing is comparatively, recent. There's a little more of it in Ireland, certainly from a relatively early stage, but you even see it spelled K-I-E. Okay, and anything in between, and certainly when you to America, first of all, the history of that differentiation isn't in line with the history of a lot of the founding of those distilleries. So it all becomes a little, and none of them seem to have taken a strong written interest. So I wouldn't.
But I just watched a documentary about Shakespeare just 2 nights ago about William Shakespeare, and they talked about how flexible spelling was in Shakespeare's age. And they said this is arguably the pinnacle of the English language. And there are 4 or 5 different documents with different spellings of Shakespeare's names from the period.
Right. You get like Shakespeare and then, literally Shakespeare and the anything in between. But it's across the board, across languages. Just nobody knew how to spell.
I had somebody tell me once that if it has just KY, it costs $20 more.
Well, he was the counter argument to that for a long time. But again, it's people pick the oddest things to create.
Yeah. Well, I never doubted for a second that it was bullshit. What I was curious about was whether or not which strand of bullshit people attach themselves to. Where there are many, like what Mark? There's one really big Kentucky brand that uses no E. Is it Maker's Mark?
It's Maker's Mark, yes.
Yeah, and okay. I think I remember being told Mark was founded by a Scottish distiller or Scottish American, and that's where it came from, or this or that,
Yeah.
I know. I mean, James Crow, like Doc Crow, was Scottish himself, and I think somebody might have said, "Oh, that's why this," and it didn't line up with the Oscar Pepper distillery or whatever. So a lot of it's pick the banalest thing.
We've got Steve Nally, Bardstown Bourbon Company. He started at Maker's Mark. He was at Maker's Mark for many years. I wonder if we could ask him if he's got any insight on that. I'll have to tuck that in my back pocket and look at that.
There you go. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I'm going to go rest up before I go trick-or-treating with children. So, Dickel is the other one. Elon Israeli said.
Dickel, that's right.
Yeah. I know there's a few. I looked up Crown Royal this morning just for another reason, for something I'm working on about Canadian whiskey, but mum's the word on that one. So have a great Halloween. Have a great return home, Fionnán.
Yes, safe travels.
In Ireland in the spring, or maybe.
Grand, yeah. And in the meantime, I'll look at the 50 text messages that have come in and probably about the website. So,
awesome. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Slán.